Are there a lot of secrets that you will take to the grave with you that have to do with you, with Jackie, with John F. Kennedy, with the president? Was there ever a time where she confided in you where it went past a friendship or relationship with you and Miss Kennedy?
I've been accused of being in love with her.
Today, I have a guest here with me, Mr. Clint Hill. Thank you for joining us. Many will say that he's probably the greatest Secret Service agent we've ever had in the history of America, and he's been written about, he's been talked about, his experiences with 5 different presidents, which we'll talk about today, his experience of working very closely with Jacqueline Kennedy. And he recently wrote a book a year ago, I think May of 2016, called 5 Presidents with Lisa McCubbin, which we'll address today as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
For me, as a kid who grew up in Iran, and I was, and we see these stories, and my mother would always talk about Jackie Kennedy and John F. Kennedy and, Onassis, and all these stories would always be told, and my wife, how much she loves Jackie. So first of all, what does it take? Like, when did you wake up one morning and say, I want to be a Secret Service agent? Like, how did that process take place?
Well, it started way back when I went to college. My intention was to become a history teacher, to coach athletics. But when I graduated, I had to go into the Army. It was toward the end of the Korean War. And when I went through the initial basic training, they then selected me to go to the Army Intelligence Center, and they trained me to be a special agent in counterintelligence.
So this isn't a choice, they selected you.
They selected me.
Got it.
I really enjoyed the type of investigations we were doing, surveillance and things of that nature. So when it was time to get out of the Army, I thought, well, I don't think I want to teach history anymore. I want to continue doing what I was doing. So I looked around to find an organization that was similar in nature. I found that there was an organization called the U.S. Secret Service that was very small, but very elite, and they were very well known for their great investigative procedures. And so I applied. Trouble was, at the time, there were only 269 agents in the entire organization.
Wow.
So there weren't any vacancies, so I had to wait. But eventually, within a year, I was selected, trained, and I worked in the field 1 year, and then I was sent to the White House and was assigned to President Eisenhower during the Eisenhower administration. That's how I came into the Secret Service, and that was my first assignment.
So now this isn't something like when you're in high school saying, I want to grow up and I want to work closely at the White House with presidents. This was not like a dream. This is just something accidental that happened.
I never had any idea that that's where I would end up.
One of the things that I'm fascinated with is people who loved what they did. Like there's a magical, like I lived through you. When I'm reading these books, I'm living through you. What did you love so much about being a Secret Service agent?
Well, it's the camaraderie with the other agents was very important, and it was like a group of brothers, a band of brothers that we worked with. And at that time, it was all male. We had no female agents until 1971 and 72. So that was important. But also, there was that sense of they had given you this responsibility. It was something that you really wanted to do your very best because you couldn't let up or couldn't let them down. I enjoyed going to work every day. It was a thrill just to be able to do that.
There's a part in the book you talk about how the first time you were given White House duties and you're going in and then you're so nervous until the moment you walked through the White House. Once you were in there was a certain sense of calm. You saw the paintings, you saw all this history. Mm-hmm. What was that like the first time going into the White House?
Well, it's very emotional, because first of all, you're somewhat apprehensive and afraid because you don't want to let yourself down. You want to do your best, and you know that you have this immense responsibility facing you. And so it's a very challenging situation. And then you get in there, and then you start to meet the supervisors and the agents, and they cause you to relax because they're just like you are. And you finally come to the conclusion, you're working around the president, you realize, well, he's a human being too, just like me. He puts his pants on one leg at a time. And so it's a much easier atmosphere than you initially think it's going to be.
When you first start working with Eisenhower, he's the first president, you work with, the general, right? 5-star general.
Yeah, in fact, he preferred to be called general, and he was called general by most of his friends, including his wife, rather than president. He loved the Army and the career he had there. We called him the boss, but he was a very congenial individual. He was easy to work with because he was always on schedule. The only challenging, not only one, but we had some challenging times with him in foreign countries because the crowds were so large. He was such a idol type figure to people in India or to...
Why do you think, though, was different when you write about him than some of the other ones? Why was he idolized?
Because of his actions in World War II. The fact that he was the supreme commander of Allied forces, and they had defeated the Germans and then the Japanese.
Clint, one of the things I'm fascinated with and curious about is, okay, so who had the biggest personality? Like when you work with some of these presidents, when they walked into the room, you felt it? Who had a sense of humor? Who was charming? Who was fun to be around? Who actually talked to you guys? What could you tell us a little bit about these different 5 personalities that you work closely with?
Well, they all had this gigantic ego, and they were bigger than life. I would say that the one individual who probably had more influence with Congress and everything would have been Johnson, because he had been there. He had been a powerful member of the U.S. Senate. Then he was vice president, and now he came into the presidency after the assassination. And he knew how to work the House and the Senate. He knew everybody that worked up on the Hill, and he could get things done. He was willing to make deals. He was willing, if you would vote on what he wanted done, he was willing to have that extra post office built in your district, or that new bridge over that Cricket River, or whatever it was that you really needed in your district.
So he was a wheeler and dealer.
Yes, he was a wheeler and dealer.
Got it.
Personality-wise, they all were, the only one of the 5 I worked with that didn't really have a close relationship with the agents would have been probably Nixon.
Nixon did not?
Not really. He was rather cold. We knew Nixon pretty well because he had been vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower. And during that time, we had a very small group of people, with just 2. But we knew him, we knew his staff. And then when he lost the election in '60 to Kennedy, and then he went back to California, and then he lost the governorship there to Pat Brown. And then he came back in '68 and won the election. But when he came into the White House in January of 1969, he brought with him a different staff. They weren't the same people that had been with him when he was vice president. Some of them, but they were kind of at arm's length. The ones that were up close and personal and really working around him were a group of individuals that we weren't familiar with. They turned out to cause problems for him, and he caused problems for himself. Nixon turned out to be somewhat of a loner. When a person is elected to the office of president, one of their big things is they're now going to be in the Oval Office. Well, Nixon had the Oval Office, but he then established an office for himself in the Executive Office Building, which is adjacent to the White House, right across a little street. And he spent considerable time in that office, a lot of times alone.
This is before or after Watergate?
This is during, before, and after.
Got it. So this is just how he is, period. It has nothing to do with Watergate.
Not really. That was his personality. He seemed to have changed during that period between the time he left the vice presidency in 1961 until he came back as president in 1969.
What do you think caused it? Like, I'm a president now, you better respect me, or is it just...
Well, he created an enemies list. There were certain people that he really thought were his enemies.
Internally, in the States?
Yeah, if they were members of the press, various people. Trouble was, he left off one person out of that list. You should have put this particular person at the top. And it should have been Richard Milhouse Nixon, because he was his own worst enemy.
Got it.
He created problems for himself. I'll give you an example. When the Pentagon Papers were released and printed in the New York Times, Nixon requested his staff to find out where they came from. They found out they came from a guy named Ellsberg. Then they found out that Ellsberg has a psychiatrist, and he ordered them to break into the psychiatrist's office burglarize it, which is unlawful, to find out what they could about his papers and his background. Well, that gave the people in his staff the idea that they could go ahead and break the law as long as they were doing it for the president. And subsequently, when Watergate happened, that's exactly what they were doing. Similar to what they had done in the Ellsberg case. And so he caused problems. Maybe he didn't directly tell them to do that, but they got the idea from what he had told them to do previously.
Interesting character. He did very good on China. I mean, he obviously gets a lot of credit for China.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of things that they say about his personality. I was in Boston a couple months back, and I went to the JFK, John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, which is a beautiful, I'm sure it's a beautiful, beautiful.
Been there many times.
I mean, when I'm walking through and you hear the stories about how this kid was the underdog of all the sons and no one expected him to be the president. It was the older brother, Joe, who in the war, what happened with him as a plane and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, one day momentum comes and he runs. And the world falls in love with this guy, right? And he becomes president. How was it working with him?
Oh, he was a great guy to work with. He was really down to earth. He treated all the agents as if they were his best friend. He was just a pleasure to work with. And I had the opportunity because I got assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. And I wasn't very happy about that because I really wanted to be assigned to the president. Because being with the First Lady was kind of like being on the second team, you know. And being with the president was where all the action always was. And but because of that, I did have a pretty close relationship with the president because I was responsible for his wife and his children. And he wanted to make sure that they were always okay.
Your book here, Miss Kennedy and Me, which is also a New York Times bestseller, fascinating book. And maybe what we could do is, you know, with your permission, have you sign a few of these and we can give some of them away to the viewers as gifts.
I'd be glad to.
So let's talk about Miss Kennedy and your relationship, if you don't mind. So I figure in a situation like this, John F. Kennedy is away a lot. He's constantly away a lot, and you're with her all the time. So you weren't just a Secret Service agent to Miss Jacqueline Kennedy. It sounded like it went from that to a relationship to a friendship. So how did that work out? Would she talk to you? Would she confide in you? Would she say, you know, Clint, I'm going through this, and would you, you know, lift her up? Was there those types of relationships?
Oh, sure, there were a lot of those.
Yeah.
Because she and I were alone a lot of time because we'd go out to Middleburg, Virginia, where they had leased a place out there so she could ride horses she loved to ride. We'd have very interesting, long conversations about various topics. We developed a very close friendship.
What would you say was the most special thing about Jackie?
Well, a lot of people don't realize how active she was. They kind of see her as this prima donna with involving clothing and that kind of thing. But she was really into history of the White House. She started a process of bringing back into the White House historical pieces of furniture, paintings. She wanted the people to be proud of the American heritage. She initiated a program where they sold pamphlets describing what was going on. They're still doing that today. I mean, she did a lot of things that a lot of people don't know about. She was very energetic, very active. She loved to water ski, play tennis, was an excellent horsewoman, rode in some horse shows. Very dedicated to the two children, Caroline and John. You see today Air Force One, that beautiful blue colored paint with the United States of America. Mrs. Kennedy did that. Back in 1961, Air Force One had an orange nose cone, and she thought it should be kind of updated, and she worked with some designers and everything, and they came up with this paint job, and it's been there ever since 1962.
Wow. When you read the book, you look for controversy. There's not a lot of controversy. It's a lot of good stories, like here's what happened, here's what happened. Are there a lot of secrets that you will take to the grave with you that have to do with you, with Jackie, with John F. Kennedy, with the presidents?
Sure.
Lots of them. Like, was there ever a time where she confided in you where it went past a friendship or relationship with you and with Miss Kennedy?
No, I don't think so. No.
You're a good-looking. I've seen your pictures. You're a very good-looking man. You know,
Well,
she's an attractive.
No, there was never anything romantic between us.
Okay, got it.
That didn't exist.
There is a little bit of that story where was there, because it doesn't seem like it's just a friendship. It seems like it went very, very The friendship was like when you read the book, you fall in love with the story of the two of you. There is a story there. It's fascinating. It's one of the reasons why it's done so well. You go on Amazon, you do reviews, you need a few days to read all the reviews. It's 1,100 reviews on Amazon. That doesn't happen by accident.
Now, I know I've been accused of being in love with her.
You've been accused of being in love with her.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it, just so you know that. I mean, the way it's written, it sounds like there was.
And I did admire her, and I thought the world of her. She was a great lady to work with, and it was wonderful to have someone like she and have the relationship we had. She trusted me implicitly, and so that really made my job much easier.
Got it. So, like I said, there's some secrets that you'll go to the grave. There's some things we'll never know, but
with every president,
of
there's
course,
something
you're gonna
I know
have some things
you'll never know.
So let's talk about the other part. My mother always liked Aristotle Onassis. Okay, he's a pretty interesting guy to like as well. And you read this in all over the place, you know, whether it's in the book and all the other things, on what John F. Kennedy once instructed you about Aristotle Onassis. He had this big personality, right? He did, and he once said, "Whatever you do in Greece, do not let Mrs. Kennedy cross paths with Aristotle Onassis." What did he mean by that?
That was in 1961, though. This was in May of 1961. I was going to Paris to do the advance arrangements for Mrs. Kennedy in Paris, and then I was going to go from Paris to Athens to make the arrangements for Mrs. Kennedy to visit Athens as a guest of Prime Minister Mrs. Karaman Lees. And the president knew that I was doing that, so he called me to the Oval Office. And I went into the Oval Office, and he was there, and his brother Robert, the Attorney General, was there. And he said, "Clint," he said, "I understand you're going to do the advance for Mrs. Kennedy in Greece." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President, that's correct." He said, "One thing I want to make sure of, and that is that Mrs. Kennedy never crosses paths with Aristotle Onassis while you're there." I said, "Fine, Mr. President, that'll be the case." So I went back to my office, and I got to thinking about it, and I thought, I wonder why he would tell me that. So the agent who was going to help me in Greece, his uncle was the chief of police in Athens. The agent's name was Kenny Giannoulis. And so I called Ken, and I told him what President Kennedy had said to me, and I said, "Do you have any notes or any idea why he would say this?" So he said, "Let me check." So he did, and he came back to me and said, "Look," he said, "Onassis is being sued by the United States government for $7 million over a deal with some Liberty ships that he is purchasing from the United States government. And it appears that because there's a congressional election coming up, they don't want a photograph of the two of them to appear. If Mrs. Kennedy is photographed with Onassis, it's going to be detrimental to any Democrat running for office in 1962. It was as simple as that. And she never did cross paths with Onassis in 1961.
There's obviously some crossing paths that took place eventually, but it's random when you hear that story and the explanation the gentleman gave you, and to have that happen a few years later, where this leads into something that one from an outsider would look at this and say, was there something going on that John F. Kennedy, he was a little bit concerned about? Because he had a reputation. Onassis had a reputation for.
Well, he was a womanizer.
Yeah, womanizer.
Yeah, he was. I mean, be honest with you, I didn't get along with the guy very well.
How was he? Was he a charming guy, or was he an arrogant, cocky guy, or
both?
Okay.
He was charming when he wanted to be, and he was a
interesting combination.
He was a mean SOB when he wanted to be.
Got it. Let's go to November 22nd, 63.
Okay, sure.
So the one day that you read about in history books, we will read about forever to come. Every year there's a movie, there's a documentary, there's an article, there's a book, there's something that's going to be written about this. This is going to happen every single year because it was the most admired, loved, let's just say, U.S. president in a long time. Him and Reagan were probably in the same category, Republican and Democrat. They were both loved and admired. What happened that morning? Was there anything different about it? How did that whole thing, start off? Was there anything that was a red flag that this day doesn't feel good, et cetera, et cetera? Or was it just a normal day? You're in Dallas, you're driving, how was that day for you?
Well, let me go back to how this all started. In June of 1963, President Kennedy met with Vice President Johnson and Governor Connally down in El Paso, Texas. And they discussed the upcoming presidential election which was in 1964. They decided that because of how close it was in 60, they really needed to carry the two states in the South that had the most electoral votes to win in 64. That meant Florida and Texas. So they agreed that they would campaign in those two states. So Kennedy went to Florida November 16th, 17th, and 18th, I think it was. Then we took off on November 21st for Texas. Now, all this time, the crowds were extremely large. They were very vociferous, enthusiastic, but they were very friendly all the way along. They were really friendly.
Is there any controversy at this time? So everyone liked, there's not really any
The only
major
controversy we saw, there were a few signs that said something about civil rights, or a few that said something about Cuba. Other than that, there was nothing. And those people were so far in the minority that, I mean, nobody really paid any attention to them.
Sure.
And by the time we got to Fort Worth, which was late at night on the 21st, we got there about 11:05 in the evening. It was raining, and we got to the Hotel Texas. There were 5,000 or 6,000 people right outside the front door. We had to almost fight our way to get into the hotel. It was so, I mean, everything was, from a political point of view, it was a smash hit because there was big crowds, and that's what they were looking for, was exposure.
Win South, win Texas, and win Florida.
And they thought if they could get the president out and among the public there in Texas. And so the next morning we wake up in Fort Worth, and first thing we realize is that we were given a brochure that was being handed out here in Dallas. It was a photograph of President Kennedy. In other words, it said, "Wanted for treason." And this was being passed among the populace here in Dallas by some organization. So we knew, that Dallas wasn't going to be all completely friendly. And we had an indication that there might be a problem with some people because about a month before, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, had come to Dallas, and he was making a speech. He was heckled. He was driven off the stage and hit with a placard. The night before we came to Dallas, Chief Curry from the Dallas Police Department got on TV and pleaded with the people of Dallas to be courteous, to show respect, which is very unusual. We did not have any intelligence information other than that incident with Stevenson, other than the fact we knew that the population in Dallas was somewhat split. There were those who really liked Kennedy, but there were those who really disliked him. But that was not unusual for anywhere in the South, because there were persons in the South that were very anti-Kennedy. So we arrive at Love Field. We had the special car that we had flown in to use in San Antonio, and then we moved it from San Antonio to Dallas, and the cars were waiting for us. That car was a Lincoln specially fabricated automobile. It had the capability of plastic bubble top being used, but we had instructions from the president that the only time that bubble top was to be used was if it were inclement weather like rain or snow, or if Mrs. Kennedy's hair was going to get all messed up because the wind was blowing too hard. Well, neither of those things existed, so no bubble top. So but that's what the trip was all about, exposure. They wanted as many people as possible to be able to see President and Mrs. Kennedy up close and personal. So we started out from Love Field, drive into the city, and the crowds just started to grow and grow and grow and grow. By the time we got to Main Street, the crowd was so large on each side of the street, at times it was difficult to get through the crowds. We had motorcycle officers on each side of the car, and we just, I got up on the back of the car numerous times to be as close to Mrs. Kennedy as I could, because our driver the president was in the right rear seat. Mrs. Kennedy was in the left rear. The driver started to keep the car to the left-hand side of the street to keep the president away from the crowd on the right. Well, that put Mrs. Kennedy right up next to the crowd. So I'd get up on the top of the back of the car and be as close to her as I could so that I could fend off anybody that was trying to do anything. I did that maybe 4 or 5 times going down Main Street. People were hanging out of windows, they were on balconies, they were on fire escapes, and it was a very friendly, enthusiastic crowd. The political people were just elated that everything was going so wonderful. Of course, we get down to Houston, and we had to turn right onto Houston in order to get over on Elm to make a left to get on Stemmons Freeway. Now, there's been a lot of criticism about that particular move. They say, well, why didn't you go straight down Main Street? Well, the reason we couldn't do that was Main Street curved off to the left onto Stemmons Freeway. We needed to go off to the right because we needed to go to the Trade Mart. And so we had to turn right on Houston and then left on Elm, which put us right in front of the Texas School Book Depository. So in that area, the crowds had diminished considerably. The biggest crowds were on Main Street. So the turn from Houston onto Elm is very sharp. And so with these big cars, we had to slow way down. And we weren't on the back of the car. I was on the car immediately behind. It's called the follow-up car. I was on the left side, which was Mrs. Kennedy's side, and I was in a forward position on a running board. And we made the turn onto Elm, and we started down Elm toward the triple underpass. And I'm looking over to my left, and there's this grassy area, and there are a few people, not a lot. Then I was looking straight ahead of us. There was this railroad over the top of this highway. We were going to go underneath it. And there were people up there, but there were also some police up there. We hadn't noticed anything about the building itself, the Texas School Book Depository. We did know that there were, I think, 3 windows open on that side, but we didn't see anything that was unusual. So I was scanning, and then all of a sudden I hear this explosive noise over my right shoulder. I didn't recognize it as a gunshot immediately, because apparently there was some echo in that area. So, but I started to turn toward that noise. I just started to turn to my right. But I only got as far as a presidential car because I saw what the president did. The president was sitting in the right rear, and all of a sudden he went like this. And then he grabbed his throat and started to fall to his left. I then realized that it was a gunshot. So I jumped from my position on the follow-up car with the intent of running and getting up on top of the presidential vehicle, the rear of it there, to form a shield there so that nothing additional could happen. I had to jump off the car, and right to my left was a motorcycle officer. And I was running, and I didn't hear anything at that time, but they told me later, while I ran, there was another shot. As I approached the president's car, I was just about grabbing the handle, and I hear another shot. I not only heard that one, I felt it, because the president at that time, he had fallen to his left farther like this. Mrs. Kennedy's, her right cheek was right up against his left. And he was down like in this position, and the bullet hit him back here, but it came out here. It erupted right here, and a portion of the skull just flipped up, and it was being held by the scalp, but it just flapped forward, and there was a hole in the skull. And I could see in that hole when I got up on top of there. But Mrs. Kennedy came up in the trunk at that time. She was trying to grab some of the material that came out of this wound, because there was blood and brain matter, bone fragments, all kinds of stuff. And so I got a hold of her and I put her in the back seat. Then he fell farther to his left. The president fell with his head in her lap, and the right side was up, so I could see in this wound. All the brain matter was gone in that area, just completely gone. And his eyes were fixed, and I assumed he was dead. It was fatal.
Right there.
Right there. It was an instantaneous death. So I turned and gave a thumbs down to the other agents so that they'd know what the situation was. And I screamed at the driver to get us to a hospital, and he hit the accelerator, and we started out. Chief Curry was in a car in front of us. He got right in front of us, and he led us to Parkland Hospital. I got myself up. I wedged myself above President and Mrs. Kennedy in the back of the car, and then hung on for dear life as we were going down Stemmons Freeway.
How many years did you relive this moment? Like, at what point? Because I'm sure, one of the things is everyone wants to ask you, so hey, how was it? Tell me these stories. How many years did you constantly relive this moment?
I'm still reliving it occasionally. I got moved from one position to another, and I was being promoted. I was still at the White House detail. And in 1970, I was given a desk job at headquarters. I was the deputy assistant director. That meant I dealt with budget and personnel, logistics, all that stuff. But I was sitting at a desk, and I had all kinds time to think. That was the wrong thing for me to do, because that one thing I thought about was what had happened in Dallas.
Wow.
And it just ate me up. And I started to really deteriorate physically from the psychological problems I was having. By 75, I couldn't pass the physical. And so they had to retire me. Then I went into a deep depression. 1982, I finally, a doctor came to me and told me I had to quit what I was doing, because when I tried to self-medicate, I was self-medicating myself with alcohol.
Wow.
After I got out of the Secret Service, and I cut myself off from everybody, and I'd never discussed what had happened with any of the agents or with my family. In 1990, I finally came back here. That I should have done in 1964.
So wait a minute, from 63 to 90, you've never come back to Dallas. And you're in Dallas today, but from 63 to 90?
I never came back to Dealey Plaza. That's what I needed to do. I needed to come back and be there, go up in the Texas School Book Depository, look out that window, really recognize the angles, the weather, everything I could. And I did that day.
How emotional was that day?
Oh, it was tough to do.
Did somebody accompany you, or
no,
did you come by yourself?
I did it myself.
Oh, you came by yourself. What did you have to do yourself? Did you have to, in your own mind, as a Secret Service, you're calculating everything? Was it, there's nothing I could do about this that we could have prevented?
But see, the problem was, we all had that sense that we failed. Our job was to protect them. We failed to do it that day. And so that's what was killing me. Because I'd been brought up that when you're given a responsibility, you carry it out to the end, you do your job. And it just ate me up that we had been unable to do our job that day. And I really had a difficult time with that. And that's why I came back to Dealey Plaza. I wanted to see myself if there was anything I could have done that I didn't do. I finally realized I'd done everything I could. Based on everything that happened, the way it happened. It wasn't until I was convinced to write this book that it really started to help me. That's the most cathartic thing I did, was to help Lisa McCubbin in writing these books and to talk about them. Once I did that, it just got better with time.
Therapeutic when you were talking about it.
Very.
Unbelievable.
And I've talked to groups who are suffering from PTSD, and that's what I was going through. And that's what I tell them, is that you've got to be willing to talk about it. If you don't, it's going to eat you up. You just have to get it out, find somebody who's a friend or a counselor, a minister, a rabbi, a priest, whoever.
Regardless. Just
doesn't matter. Talk about it.
Yeah. So the way I think about it when I watch it, first of all, what you did, I mean, right there, that moment, a person learns about your instinct. Your instinct is to protect. There is no test that you're going to do as a Secret Service agent to know how you're going to react when somebody's shot on the job. That's when the world found out who you really were when you jumped. Your instant reaction was boom, just on top. That I think the reason why the world has such an affinity, whenever you read anything about you, obviously you can't please everybody. Whenever you read anything about you, the affinity the world has for you, for what you did that day, is probably one of the main reasons why there's so much respect for you, for what you did. And I know, there's a lot of different careers you could have chosen. You have a fascinating story, but one of the questions I would have for you now is, okay, so that was in November 22nd, 63. Today, are we safer today? Are presidents safer today? Or is the likelihood of something like that happening higher today than it was, 53 years ago?
Well, I can say this. The job of the Secret Service today is much more challenging
You would
than
say
it was
more challenging today.
Much more challenging than it was in 63 or in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, even the 80s. There are so many new things going on in the world. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it can work against you and it can work for you. And you always are challenged by that new technology. I am so respectful of the agents that are working today, because they really have their hands full. Thank God we don't use open cars anymore, but even so, I've always said that you never know what's around the corner. You have no idea until you get there. Security is never 100%, and that's almost what you have to be. You can't let your guard down ever. They're doing a good job. I think they've done an excellent job in the last 2 years with when they brought Joe Clancy back to be the new director. And Joe has done a tremendous job.
Final thoughts before we wrap up. 3 biggest life lessons you've learned. You've been around a lot of interesting people and you've learned, you've had a lot of different experiences. If you can teach us 3 things from your life, everything you've learned, what could you leave us? 3 things we can learn from you.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that you'll learn a hell of a lot more from listening than you do from talking. So listen to what people say, listen to instructions you're given, pay attention. A lot of people have the opinion that it's better to talk than to listen. That's unfortunate because that doesn't work. And always do your best. Sometimes you may feel that the job you're doing is really beneath you or something, but if you do your best and really try your hardest to be a success, you will gradually improve and get a lot better position. I know it's hard to see when you're on the bottom of the rung of a ladder, but it's true that the guys that start on the bottom and work their way up, those are the happiest guys. It wasn't handed to them, they earned it. Get as much education as you can and as much experience as you can just in life. Volunteer to do things that maybe they're a little out of your area of expertise, but you'll learn from it. And the more you know, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
That's amazing. So again, thank you so much for coming by and spending this time with us here. Fascinating. I've met a lot of interesting people. This was a fascinating story, just spending the hour with you and going through the book. And here's what I would like to do to everybody else who's watching this. So we're going to have Mr. Hill sign 3 copies of this book, Miss Kennedy and Me, and 1 copy of 5 Presidents. That'll be signed. This is what I need you to do if you want to participate in this contest. I'm going to post this on my Instagram account. I need you to go tag 5 people, anybody, 5 people on the Instagram account. You tag 5 people. We're going to choose 4 winners. 4 people we're going to select as winners, and I'll announce those on Snapchat. So you got to make sure you follow me on Snapchat to announce the winners to you. But the day this video goes live, the picture is going to be on my Instagram account. You got to go tag 5 people because we need as many people to read these stories as possible with 5 presidents as well as Miss Kennedy and Me. And then we'll pick 4 winners and we'll send a copy to each of those winners to have this book not only in your hands, but have it signed by Mr. Clint Hill himself. With that being said, thank you so much for coming out. It was my honor to have a chance to meet
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure being.
Pleasure mine.